Hello and welcome along to the industry analysis for the operational case study of February 2019. Here we're going to be looking at the real-world playground equipment manufacturing industry. This can be a tricky industry to analyse if you're going it alone, so luckily for you, we have dug deep and we've gotten some of the most important information and data points for this industry and analysed them in terms of broader cultural and social trends that have an influence on this industry in various respects. It's important to do an industry analysis for the case study because it helps you to anticipate some of the issues and problems and scenarios that might arise in the case study exam in February. So without further ado, let's have a quick look at what we'll be covering in this industry analysis. So first we'll start with a quantitative analysis. We're going to be looking at some of the key market trends and figures from this industry. And then from there, we're going to move into a qualitative analysis and we're going to be interpreting some of those trends and figures that we analysed in section 1 in terms of themes like urbanisation, safety, obesity concerns, and a number of other factors as well. Then in section 3, we're going to shift the focus to some real-world case studies. We're going to be looking at two companies in particular that are relevant in various and different ways to this particular industry, and we'll be going into some deep detail on those companies, their policies, their strategies, and some of the innovations and good ideas that they've had in recent years. That will help us to possibly anticipate some of the changes that will be made by the preceding company Trig Adventure in the coming years, and that might again help you to anticipate some of the issues that will arise in the case study exam in February. And finally then in section 4 we will look at various opportunities, challenges and threats facing companies within the playground equipment and manufacturing industry. So let's start with section 1 in the quantitative analysis. We're looking here first at the outdoor and sports toys sales figures from the United States for the last 15 or so years. The reason we're focusing on this category or this segment is because this is about as fine-grained as you can get when it comes to getting good data and good market trends figures for the playground equipment industry, or sub-industry is probably a more appropriate way of titling it. And so this is where you want to look because the playground equipment industry is within this category, this outdoor sports toys category broadly speaking. And so we'll be focusing on that for the purposes of this analysis. So a lot of the trends that manifest within this segment will apply equally to the playground equipment industry as well. We're going to look at the playground equipment industry as well, specifically in some more detail, particularly with respect to things like social and cultural factors in subsequent sections. So you can see here what we have is a fairly modest growth scenario, it has to be said, overall for the last 15 years or so. Around the middle of the last decade, we can see obviously around the financial crisis time, there was a slump around 2007, 2008, 2009, and since around 2010, we have seen something of a rebound. You might be wondering what this kind of anomaly here is for 2011 and 2012. That actually has a lot to do with one company alone releasing two blockbuster products in those 2 years. That is the company of Nerf, which we mentioned just prior in the overview. We'll come back to Nerf a little bit later on and why they're such an important company, but they released two blockbuster products in those years, and those products fell within this category of outdoor and sports toys, and for that reason there was a huge jump because of the popularity of those two products, and that pushed sales in the United States up in those 2 years. Around 2013 we returned to something like a normal growth trend, and that has been the case ever since. We've seen a healthy but not spectacular growth trend since then up until around 2017. So that was for the United States, and obviously the United States often leads the way in terms of broader global trends, and particularly trends in other developing nations and industrialized economies, so we can expect similar kinds of trends to obtain in those countries as well. Here we're focusing on a breakdown of the various toy categories: youth electronics, dolls, action figures and accessories, all other toys, vehicles, arts and crafts, infant and preschool toys. Then we have the outdoor and sports toys segment just here. Now you can see, compared to, for example, youth electronics, unfortunately outdoor and sports toys are considerably behind in terms of the growth percentage change from 2017 to 2018. This is what we're looking at here, that particular year-to-year change in the most recent phase. And outdoor and sports toys, relatively modest growth, it has to be said, in the grand scheme of things, looking at it as about a 5 to 6% change over the previous year, but still it's moving in the right direction, and that's a good sign, just looking at it alone in isolation. But of course, comparatively, it is not all that good compared to youth electronics. We're going to come back to this issue of electronics in more detail now, with the frequency of digital play versus other forms of play amongst children 12 years and under. And you can see here again, touchscreen play is out considerably in front of other categories, getting in ahead of dolls and action figures, which is the second most played with category for children under 12 years of age. So that really underlines again just how important the digital component is becoming in the toy category, as we saw in the previous slide. And here again, it's really, really importantly emphasized. Perhaps surprisingly, game consoles there you can see up above is actually behind a lot of the more traditional categories. So that's construction and blocks, arts and crafts, and dolls and action figures. They're still considerable in terms of their share of how often children are using those kinds of toys. But touchscreen is still the number one. So that includes things like smartphone games and iPad games and so on and so forth. They really are pushing on amongst younger generations, and 12 and under is no exception. Looking at it again, a similar breakdown here. This is focusing again on the United States, but you can expect broadly the same trends in other developed nations. Screen-based play way out ahead at 18.6 hours. This is free time hours per week spent by US children on average with the different kinds of play. Indoor screen-free play then is at number 2 at 14.6 hours. And outside play then, which is where we would have the playground equipment category, is in and around 10.6 hours. So that's about 8 hours less on average per week that US children, for example, are spending on outdoor play. So let's move on then to look at this in a little bit more detail, because I think it's important to get a good sense of the comparative growth figures for these different segments. Here we're focusing on video games, broadly speaking, and that includes subcategorization of mobile games, PC games, and console games. You can see it in the color key there. And look at just how spectacular that compound annual growth rate is for the mobile games in particular. And again, that's the touchscreen category that we saw in the previous slides. That is a spectacular growth trajectory when you compare it to the other subcategories, even within this video games market, compared to PC and console, for example, which have relatively modest growth rates, is at 26.8% compound annual growth rate for the mobile games market. So again, that's really the big mover in this domain amongst children in terms of the play equipment that they're using. This is way, way, way out ahead. And we look then at another really important graph here, and this will tie in with some of the cultural and social issues which we come to later on. I'll explain a bit more detail why this is significant and how this could be really important for a company like Trig Adventure. Obesity is growing worse around the world, perhaps unsurprisingly, but it is the same story for boys and girls as it is for women and men. Those trends are going in the wrong direction ever since the 1980s, and there shows no sign of slowing down. So childhood obesity is a big topic in the mainstream media. It's a big area of concern for parents, and that could have very important implications for various industries within the toy market, broadly construed. I want to focus now more generally on some projections for the playground equipment sub-segment in particular. So here we have some good data on the playground equipment industry specifically. And we're looking at various features such as different kinds of products. Looking at the slides market in particular, this is the most popular component of the playground equipment industry. The global freestanding playground slides market is expected to reach 4.869 billion by 2021. So very, very frequently you find in various economies that it is the playground slides which are the biggest seller in terms of the discrete products that these companies are selling. Specialty stores here in the middle. In 2016, specialty stores dominated the global market with a share of 48.79%. And then you look at the market in the Americas in general. In terms of revenue, the market in the Americas will reach 6.147 billion in 2021. So this is an industry, or a sub-industry if you like, that is not to be sniffed at. There is quite a lot of money in this still, and it's growing modestly compared to the video games market and the touchscreen games market in particular, but it is still a very large market in absolute terms. Looking then at the growth projections here at the bottom, you can see the 2016 value was about 11.4 billion, and the 2021 projected value is coming in at around 13.533 billion. So that looks to be around a 3% compound annual growth rate for the period 2017 to 2021. So the reason I wanted to focus on that compound annual growth rate figure was because if we go back to the previous slide, you can see that's compared to the mobile games market, compound annual growth rate for roughly the same period of in and around 20% if you're looking at it just from 2016-17 up until 2021. So a really, really big move there. But it is certainly moving in the right direction, but very, very much more modestly than some other toy segments and toy categories. So now again, we're moving back to this games market here. This is for the same period. Looking at the various segments all together, we've got boxed downloaded PC, browser PC, console, tablet, and smartphone. And you can see if you're taking all of those together for 2016 to 2020, it's about 6.2% compound annual growth rate. So that's, again, double the compound annual growth rate for the playground equipment sub-industry in particular. So that is a really important one to keep an eye on, because, of course, that's going to be competing for children's time. And the question is, how do more traditional toy segments and indeed the more active play involved with playground equipment, how can they entice children away from those kinds of categories and encourage parents as well to get their children to spend more time on those more traditional toys, and in particular on the category of playground equipment. We're going to come back to that a little bit later, because that's has a lot of factors playing into it, a lot of considerations, and it is quite a complex question in many respects. So let's get started on that qualitative analysis. Moving back to that issue of obesity, unsurprisingly perhaps, it is well established by this point that there is a good connection, a causal connection between increasing technology prevalence, I should say, in an industry or in a society or an economy, and increases in obesity rates. So you can see here, for every 10% increase in information communications technology investment, there is a 1% increase in obesity rates. You add to that then increase in obesity rates from the indirect effects of more time in front of the screen, such as snacking, for example, and you get a total increase in obesity rates of 1.4%, and that's for every 10% increase in information technology investment. And you might think, well, 1.4%, that's no big deal, but how do you actually translate that into real terms? What does this mean for a country, for example, the size of the United States of 300 million? Well, it means 4.2 million newly obese people. So that is not something that is trivial by any stretch of the imagination, and you can imagine the pressure that puts on public health systems, for example. So what has changed in the past 20 years? Well, we probably already know this, but portion sizes and eating patterns seem to be a problem. People are eating more. It's in the United States in particular, but in other Western nations and developed countries as well. Sedentary lifestyles and less strenuous work. So the sedentary lifestyle concern is certainly something as well that would apply to younger generations and to children as well. And that, again, pertains and goes back to the issue of technology and how much time children are spending, relatively speaking, on those kinds of toys, those digital toys and tech toys and touchscreen toys, compared to the more traditional kinds of toys. And that certainly is something that seems to factor into the rates of childhood obesity. So there's been a reaction against this, unsurprisingly, both on the part of parents and public health officials, and politicians as well are getting in on the act. You can see here from this headline, there's an interesting article which is linked in the sources at the end of this industry analysis. The Great Outdoors, Euromonitor talks the outdoor toy space. Increased screen time is having a knock-on effect across the globe, and increasingly parents are becoming concerned about the lack of physical activity among their children. Euromonitor's Matthew Hudak explains why these parents are turning to toys to get kids moving more. Unsurprising move here from parents, because of course it's always very hard to get children to do things that are right and to do things that are healthy. often it's an uphill struggle, and so an obvious way of kind of tricking kids into doing what's good for them is to make it fun and make it as fun as possible, and so toys is the natural first port of call in that respect. And so it is a big opportunity in that respect for playground manufacturers and playground equipment manufacturers, and that is indicated and reflected in the headline picture that you can see there in the background for this article. You can see the children there on some kind of playground equipment, and you can see a lot of safety equipment as well, which is something we will come back to shortly. So what are the key growth drivers for this market in general, for the playground equipment sub-industry in particular? Technavio has done a good analysis on the playground equipment industry, global freestanding playground equipment market 2017 to 2021, and they're looking here at drivers and forecasts. So the analysts at Technavio highlight the following three key market drivers that are contributing to the growth of global's freestanding playground equipment market. You have growing urbanization rates, you have an increase in the number of preschools, and then you have benefits associated with outdoor sports, which relates to what we were just talking about. So let's look a little bit more detail at each of these key growth drivers in turn. So first we have growing urbanization. This is more pertaining to developing nations. We're seeing rapid urbanization in places like Brazil, China, and India. And it has seen a concurrent increase in demand for child products as people are able to afford better products. One of the key reasons for this is that rapid urbanization has also led to a higher number of working women, crucially, and dual income households. So as both parents are going off to work, parents are increasingly concerned about how the children are spending that time away in schools or in daycare facilities or in various other places where children might be sent during those work hours. And they want to ensure that the children are getting the best care possible. And one of the concerns and considerations, obviously, will be that they're getting the right kind of physical activity and stimulation. And so playground equipment will be indirectly demanded as a result of that shift towards increased urbanization. What about the second growth driver then, the increase in the number of preschools? Again, this kind of relates back to what was said before about the increased number of working women in developing nations and dual income households. Working parents, due to excess work, are often not able to spend enough quality time with their children, and they therefore consider preschools often as the best alternative to home learning. Preschools then is a major demand source for playground equipment. Again, perhaps unsurprisingly, but the important thing to note is that these are on the move in the right direction. They're growing, they're cropping up more and more, and especially in those developing nations, and they're very much growth markets when it comes to demand for preschool playground equipment. And finally then, the benefits associated with outdoor sports. Of course, we've already touched on this. Parents are increasing their focus on childhood development from a young age, which has led to a rise in demand for outdoor sports equipment, including freestanding playground equipment.